My name is Andrea Dempsey, and today I'll be discussing tides and the adaptations of organisms inhabiting intertidal zones. So to start, we have to begin with the basic definition. What are tides? And tides are the vertical movement or the rise and fall of the sea surface. And also to start off with two important terms regarding tides, which is the tidal range, average vertical distance between water level at high and low tide, and the tidal period, which is time between successive high tides. And here's an image just showing high and low tide, and as you can see, it is in the same area. And at low tide, we see some people sitting on the rocks, and at high tide, that's something we don't see because, of course, they would be submerged in that instance. So to talk more about high and low tide, we can say that high tide corresponds to the crest of the wave, which, as you can see on the diagram below, is the highest point of the wave. And low tide, which corresponds with the trough of the wave, which is the lowest part of the wave. Also, to discuss some of the famously high tidal ranges and the famously small tidal ranges that we see, the two famously high tidal ranges both occur in Canada, one being on the left, which is the Bay of Fundy, and as you can see, the tide is so low at low tide that the boat is hitting the substrate, and on the right, the Ungava Bay, which you can just see a lot of exposed sand here and people walking on an area that's usually covered in water. And the two famously small tidal ranges are the Mediterranean and the Adriatic Sea. And both of these images don't necessarily show the low tidal range because that's not something you can really show well compared to the high tidal range. However, it does kind of show the calmness of the bay, and there are also just beautiful photos of the bays as well. Another fact is that tides behave as shallow water waves as opposed to deep water waves. And what this means is they do lose energy when they come in contact with the sea floor, and this is due to friction. This also means that tide celerity, which is wave speed, depends on water depth, and particularly the equation for that is tide celerity equals 1/20th of water depth. So when you ever need to calculate the speed of a tide, you need to compare it to 1/20th of water. And then a lunar day, because a lunar day is something we need to talk about with tides because moons do dictate the tides, and which I will talk more about later, but lunar day is actually different from the 24-hour day that we are used to. So this is the time it takes for Earth to rotate from an exact point under the moon to the same point under the moon. And this takes approximately 24 hours and 50 minutes. And this extra 50 minutes just comes from the catch-up time that the Earth needs to catch up to the moon, basically. So this means if there are regular tides too high and too low that day, there are approximately 6 hours and 12.5 minutes between high and low tides on that particular day. So let's talk about what tides are really caused by. So mainly, tides are caused by the gravitational attraction between the Earth, Moon, and Sun. So we have the law of universal gravitation, and that was actually put in place with Mr. Sir Isaac Newton right here. And this law does say that the gravitational attraction between two bodies is directly proportional to the product of the masses of the two bodies, and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. What does this mean? Well, distance is a huge part of it. The moon does dominate the tides, even though the sun is much bigger. Distance definitely outweighs mass when it comes to gravitational attraction. And you can see by the figure on the right of the slide the different force formulas for the tides. So you see that tide generating force equals mass over distance cubed. And then tide generating force of the sun is sun's mass over sun's distance to Earth cubed. So then you know that it's not really based on mass. It's the distance that really affects the gravitational pull. And that's why the moon is what really dominates the tides as compared to the sun. So then we can talk about tidal bulges, which is a very interesting concept that has to do with tides. So the tidal bulges are bulges on the sea surface, and they are due to the moon's pull. There is one bulge that is facing the moon, and the other is on the opposite side. And I will get to what each of the bulges mean on the next slide. You can also see a dotted line on the figure that shows the mean sea level and also the rotation of the Earth. So tidal bulges, the two different ones, are created by a combination of gravity and inertia. The bulge that is facing the moon is due to moon's gravitational pull, and that's the tidal bulge that's fully due to gravity. And then we have on the other side, the opposite side, a bulge that's due to inertia, which surpasses gravitational force on the opposite bulge. Because water is still trying to move away from the Earth, and that force of wanting to go in that straight line kind of overcomes the gravitational pull of the moon because it is on that opposite side. So you're still seeing that bulge, and that's solely mostly due to inertia. So then we can talk about solar versus lunar tides, because the sun does play a part, even though it's not as large. So the solar tides are Earth and Sun attraction, and lunar tides are Earth and Moon attraction, which we know from previous slides is stronger than Earth and Sun attraction. So the figure below, it just shows a diagram of the moon, Earth, and Sun in a straight line, which actually causes a spring tide, which we will learn about later on. But you can see that the bulges created from the solar tide are much smaller, about half the size of the lunar tide bulges. So how does the sun also affect the tides? There's another important term that comes up that's called declination, and this is the angular distance of the sun or moon in relation to the equator. So we know the vernal and autumnal equinoxes, and that's when the sun is at minimum declination, which means it's right above the equator. It's exactly 0 degrees of an angle from the equator, and here sometimes we see higher tides. And then there's the summer and winter solstice, and the sun is at maximum declination, meaning that it's at a high angle from the equator. And here we see a stronger tidal bulge for solar tides. Some other terms too is we have aphelion, which is approximately around July 2nd, and this is when the Earth is furthest from the sun and we have the smaller tidal ranges. And also perihelion, which is approximately around January 2nd, and this is when the Earth is closest to the sun and there's larger tidal ranges. So you can see below it shows the two different dates that I was speaking about, and you can see that perihelion is closer. And then you see two other terms down there, perigee and apogee, which just refer to the same thing, but from the lunar perspective. So you have perigee, which is when the moon is closer, and when the moon is closer to the sun, and apogee when the moon is further away. So what are some other factors that affect tides? Well, there is the shape of the shoreline, which can be a factor in it. And this is an example of a shoreline that's kind of funnel shaped. And this typically leads to higher tides with more aggregation and turbidity. Also, shapes of bays and estuaries. Believe it or not, narrow estuaries actually calm the tides a bit, and we don't see too much aggregation going on in a narrow channel. Then, of course, there's also wind and weather patterns that affect the tides and the wave action in general. So now we get into some basics of the different types of tides. So there's 3 different types of tides, and I'll start here with semi-diurnal. Semi-diurnal is a tide that means through the tidal day, which is the lunar day as we spoke about before, there's 2 equal high tides and 2 equal low tides, which you can see by the graph. They're not exactly the same, but as you can see, this low tide is a little bit higher than this one, but they're about equal to each other as compared to this type of tide, which is mixed. This is also 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day. The difference here is the high tides and low tides are unequal, as you can see also by the graph below. And then third, there's diurnal, which is actually only 1 high tide and 1 low tide per tidal day. So referring back to the lunar day that we said is 24 hours and 50 minutes, and saying that if we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides, it's 12 hours or 6 hours and 12.5 minutes between the tides. This one would actually be double that. So since there's only 1 high tide and 1 low tide a day, it would be about 12 hours between the high and low tide, and that's the difference there. And then there's spring and neap tides, which I mentioned spring earlier very briefly. That's actually when the sun, moon, and earth are in a straight line. And here we see the highest high tide and the lowest low tide. And in neap tide, we see it's during the 3rd quarter moon and the 1st quarter moon phases, as opposed to new moon and full moon. And they're kind of in a line that's perpendicular to the earth and the sun. The moon and the earth, they meet at a perpendicular line. And there we see the lowest high tide and the highest low tide, so the opposite. And then there's open ocean tides, and sometimes we see internal tidal waves. And internal tidal waves can be caused by different features of the sea floor, like seamounts or ridges. And dense water is forced into slightly less dense water and then is pulled back down, causing horizontal wave pattern. And you can see that in the image above. There was a video showing this. This is a clip from the video, and it's just a really cool image showing the colors show the different density in the water and what's causing this internal wave. And these internal tidal waves are very important for mixing deep ocean water. So then we move on to tidal currents. Here we have the flood tide and the ebb tide, which are different currents that we see with tides. And as you can tell by the diagram above, the flood currents are directed towards the land, so we see them going in, which kind of makes sense if you think flood towards land. If you think your house is getting flooded, the water's coming towards your house and flooding. And then ebb tide, which is the opposite, as the water flows out to sea. And the speed of tidal currents can actually reach several kilometers per hour, so tidal currents can be pretty fast. I'm going to be talking about a tidal current that's called a tidal bore. And a tidal bore is caused from a large tidal range. And as you can see below, this is a really, really cool image of someone actually surfing on a tidal bore. And it's moving pretty fast, and it's as the tide is coming in. It's the flood tide as it flows through a narrow channel, and it causes turbulent water. And this is something you'd see again in a funnel-shaped bay, as I referred to the effects of different shorelines and tide. So how are tides measured then? Tides are measured in a couple of different ways. So we have different satellite readings that can be done. And satellites typically just give measurements of high tide and low tide when they happen throughout the day. And that's how we can tell what type of tide that we're seeing that day, and can help us to measure spring and neap tides as well. And then below there's a picture which is called a tide house, which I recently learned about, which is really, really cool. So the tide house kind of protects the data logger, but underwater that we have submerged at the dock here is a pressure sensor that kind of measures the water level, and then the acoustic sensor as well, and the protective well that encompasses that, and the calibration and sounding tube within that. And then all of this data is collected and sent into the data logger, and we're able to see the movement of the tide below this dock here to see the changes in water level throughout the day. And then there's also smaller things like tide monitoring stations, what you see on the right here, and that's kind of a smaller recording device that's also a little bit protected, but not as much, and it measures the similar things, but it also measures meteorological data, so we have some weather and wind patterns measured with that as well, which correlate with tides, as we mentioned in effects of tides earlier on in the presentation. So why is it so important that we understand tides? Well, tides move organisms. So not only do they just move plankton that are weak swimmers that are moved by the water, but they're also a part of migration. They can help with organisms moving to and from, especially ones that can't really swim on their own. And it can lead to where they're settled, it can lead to where they're breeding, where they're feeding, and etc. And they can also help to explain changes in climate. We want to know a lot about tides because with our current situation and with climate change and things changing, the tides can tell us a lot about that. Also, we know, speaking of organisms again, tides do dictate the lives of intertidal species, which I'll get into later because that's the second part of my presentation. And also, which as scientists we don't care about quite as much, but recreational purposes are important as well because of course we know that tides affect surf, swimming, recreational boating, fishing. Tides bring in different fish, and ship navigation as well. You can see a picture of a ship on the bottom that's actually a bit stranded because it's caught at low tide, and it's important to know high and low tide so that this situation doesn't happen to you, especially if you're navigating a boat. So let's move in now to the intertidal habitat now that we have a basic understanding of tides, and well, hopefully not too basic, hopefully a little bit in depth with the different terms and everything. So the intertidal habitat is a very difficult habitat for organisms to live in. There's many stresses, for example, air exposure, prolonged submersions, wave action, and salinity variations. And here's just some different ideas of those stressors. So on the left here we have some air exposure of this algae on the rock, and in the middle just the submersion in this large tidal pool and some wave action here on the right. So what defines an intertidal zone? An intertidal zone is the zone between the highest and low tides along marine shores. So just to zoom in on that image here, we have the intertidal zone, and here is how high the water will come up, which is called the high water mark, and that would be at high tide how far the water would come up. And the low water mark here is how low the level would be at low tide. So there's some different types of intertidal zones that I'm going to briefly mention and then only go into detail about two. We have the sandy intertidal zone, the rocky intertidal zone, mangroves, estuaries, and coastal fjords. So we're going to specifically go into more detail about sandy and rocky intertidal zones. We see a rocky one on the left here and sandy on the right. So there's also different zones of the intertidal before we get started. So intertidal zones have vertical zonation, top down and bottom up. And the different zones we have are upper intertidal, which is closest to land, and this is only ever flooded during high tide. And then we have the mid-intertidal, which is covered and uncovered once or twice a day. Then lastly, the low intertidal, which is when always water is available. There's always water available unless there's extremely low tide, like maybe spring tide when it's the lowest of low. And here's just a picture showing some of the different critters that live on the rocky intertidal here in these different zones. So let's start with the soft bottom intertidal, the sandy shores. So what are some of the main stressors? Well, we have variable salinity levels, we have predation, and this is a picture of a bird predating on a clam because the water is so far away and the clam is more exposed to that predation than before. There's also air exposure, there's wave action. So now I'm going to talk about some of the inhabitants. We have crabs, like a mole crab you see, some clams, here's some coquinas, snails, worms sticking out of the sand here, and interstitials, which are microscopic organisms that live in between the sand grains. So referring to the stressors before, some of the adaptations that the organisms have are burrowing, which is really cool. We can see in the mole crabs here that burrow, and we also see that in the clams as well. I just thought this was a good representation of it, and that helps a lot with predation because the birds are less likely to be able to reach if they're burrowing super low in the sand when the water is away. And also we see with clams, there's a hard outer shell, which also helps them to avoid predation and can help with water loss. And here you can see from the side a clam that's pretty thick and it has that really hard calcified outer shell. Moving on to rocky intertidal then, which is on rocky shores. Some of the stressors here are temperature variations, air exposure, salinity variations, and for example, at the high water mark, the tide pools can become brackish or fresh water when they don't have that influx of salt water and they're sitting out sometimes, referring back to the timing, 12 hours or 6 hours between low tide and high tide, that they're just sitting there without that influx of salt water and they may become brackish or even freshwater due to runoff or freshwater rain that occurs at the time. So here's a picture of the tide pools, and they're pretty big and kind of towards the low water mark, and sometimes it's the smaller ones that are more prone to becoming brackish or freshwater. And rocky intertidal, I did say wave action for sandy shores because of course there are waves coming into the sandy shore, but we have the burrowers, so there's just less wave action to be involved. And the problem with wave action in rocky shores is just that the substrate is so hard. So not only do we have the possibility of organisms washing away, but we have the possibility of organisms being jolted into the rocky substrate, which wouldn't be good as well. And then also we have desiccation, which is the act of drying out. And here's just a picture of some algae that's looking pretty dry, exposed to the air in a rocky intertidal zone. There's also predation here as well, but we don't see it quite as much as sandy shores. So what are some of the inhabitants then of rocky intertidal zones? Because they are different. So we have barnacles, limpets, and chitons, and you'll see why I'm organizing this briefly. So here's a chiton. They're one of my favorites. I think they're adorable. And then there's algae, mussels, sea stars, and crabs. And here's a little cushion star, which are also very cute and tiny. They're probably grow a little bit bigger than the tip of your thumb, a little bit wider than that all around. And then seagrasses, urchins, and tube worms. And the reason that I organized these lists like this, and here's a picture of some sea urchins, is I wanted you to just remember that top-down zonation that we talked about, and that's the order I kind of have these organisms listed in. So the barnacles, limpets, and chitons we see in the upper area where things are more dry, and that's what they can handle because of their adaptations. And then in the middle region we have algae, mussels, sea stars, and crabs, and the low tidal, which is seagrasses, urchins, and tube worms that are typically always needing to be submerged, which works for them here. So some of the adaptations in the rocky intertidal zones include vaporization of internal water reserves. And we see that with mussels. They're able to retain water because they're not open when they're not submerged, and they have water retained in there to avoid water loss so that they can suffer through air exposure until the next high tide. And we have gaping shells as well, and this occurs in mussels, and this is also for water loss, and it's to help them avoid water loss. There's also antifreeze proteins in some organisms, which is to help from freezing during air exposure. And then there's attachment. So this is most important for wave action. If we have permanent attachment to the substrate, these organisms don't have to worry about being knocked off or thrown into anything because they're permanently attached. The only problem with that is that they're stuck where they are, and they should be adapted to the air exposure if they're these type of organisms, but if not, they're kind of screwed because they're permanently attached to that substrate. And then we also have reduced metabolism, and this can help with the nutrient stressors when there's not water and stuff like that. And compartmentalization, which specifically helps with salinity stressors. So this is just to compartmentalize the ions of salt in the organism's body to be able to retain that when there's, say, stuck in a tide pool that's becoming pretty fresh or brackish. So to close off, I want to talk about some of the human impact affecting intertidal zones, because we know that tides affect intertidal zones because they kind of dictate the way that these organisms live and the way that they had to adapt to this lifestyle. And humans are actually cause a big impact as well. So we can talk about coastal development. In coastal development, you can see, which came up on the left here, is when things are being built right along the coast. And we know for a fact that that's not a good idea because we know that sand moves, we know that sea level is rising, and as sea level rises, the tides are not going to change and they're going to keep moving in, and it's just going to get closer and closer. So we have this coastal development that's eventually going to get wiped away, but it can really affect the intertidal organisms as well, just with the construction and just the humans being present. Speaking of that, there's a lot of beach tourism, and this of course is more affecting the sandy shores, which we see in the picture at the bottom left. And sandy shore organisms, of course, you know, you go to the beach and you dig for mole crabs when you're little, and you look for coquina clams, and that's just, as you get older, you realize it's pretty invasive, and it's when you have a lot of kids doing that, you have a lot of adults telling them that's okay. That can really affect the lifestyle and the health of the community that lives there. And then there's invasive research as well, because as scientists, we're not perfect, and sometimes, yes, research does require us to invade a community and affect them in some way. But there's different ways to do it. Surveys are a much less invasive way. And this is an example. It looks like they are doing a survey because they have their little grids. I don't see their transect line, but I'm sure they have it. And just observing can be invasive sometimes. If you're going to be touching the creatures, just try to avoid. But if it's just counting and surveying, it can lead to really good science and being able to see the biodiversity of these rocky intertidal zones. And lastly, the dreaded dredging. And here's a picture of just a construction site and the beach about to be dredged. And of course, we know that this is bad news for either rocky and tidal zones or sandy tidal zones, because it's really just pulling up their habitat. It's pulling up their surrounding environment. We have interstitials being thrown around, anything that was buried in the sand or not being deposited elsewhere. And of course, we know organisms from their community is just never a good thing. So that concludes my presentation on tides and adaptations of intertidal organisms. I hope you learned something and enjoyed. Thank you.